Now I'm going to show you how to do the big stitch quilting to tack down the binding on the back. So I showed you how to do the ladder stitch to hand stitch it down, and this is going to be a big stitch quilting to tack it down. And I know some of you wanted me to review over this again on how to tie the knot. So for this, for the big stitch, I'm only going to use a single strand of thread. So I'm going to take my end and I'm going to meet it with my needle. They're going to be pointing at each other. I'm going to grasp the end of the thread and I'm going to wind it around my needle 2, maybe 3 times. I'll just do 3. This isn't a big deal. Wind it around 3 times while I'm still holding on to the end. Then I'm going to take the part that I wound and I'm going to put it in between my first 2 fingers here. So I'm holding on to the part that is wound around the needle. I'm going to grab the needle with my other hand and I'm going to slide the needle out from that wound area. And I still have that wound area in between my 2 fingers. And I'm pulling, pulling, pulling until I get to the end. And there's my knot. So we'll see how well this works. Normally I would have a thicker binding to do this, or wider binding to do this, but for lesson purposes, I think this will work. So I want to go through, I want to hide my knot in between these layers. So here's my binding. Here's the quilt. I'm taking my knot and I'm putting it in between. So it's going to be hidden in there. And then I'm going to fold my binding over. And I'm going to take my needle, come right to the edge of the binding here. Okay. Fold the binding down. It's a little trickier to get started because you don't have anything holding this down. So if you wanted to, you could take the clover clips and kind of hold down the binding so it lays flat for you. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start quilting. And this is really no different than straight line quilting, only we're going to be doing it on the binding. So I'm going to go down in, and I don't want to go all the way through. I don't want to hit the back of my quilt and have that needle come through. So you just basically need to catch a little bit of your backing, and then you're going to come right back out. So just to show you, the needle didn't come through all 3 layers. And I take a couple stitches at a time. And this, I definitely use my needle. So I'm using, or thimble. I'm using my thimble to push on this needle. And I'm just barely poking it down into all those layers. When I say the layers, what I mean is this part, the quilt sandwich itself. I don't want to go back through the other part of the binding. I just want to get it in this quilt sandwich area. So I've just made, what, 2 stitches really here. I'm going to push it all the way through. And with these silicone needles or thimbles made by Clover, it's fantastic because you can use this silicone part to grab onto your needle and pull. Sometimes it gets to be a little tough. So there, oh, I had 3 stitches there. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm just going to make, and you want to try to get all your stitches about the same length. Just going to keep going in and out. In and out. Push the needle. Pull it with the silicone part. And there you go. And you can see how fast I did that. I mean, I've already got several inches in a matter of seconds. So this really goes fast. And you just keep working your way down the same way you do when you're doing the ladder stitch. But this gives you a big stitch. And honestly, it is so much faster. It just gives it more of a handmade look. So it depends on if you want your stitches or your binding. It depends on if you want your binding to look like it's nice and clean. Then you would do the ladder stitch. When you use this big stitch quilting for your binding, it just gives it a more handmade, a more textured look on the back. So it just kind of goes with whatever style you're looking for. The other option that you have with this, with the big stitch binding, is you can change out the color of your thread. So you could, say for instance, you had a black binding on your quilt. You could use a white thread to do the quilting, and that would just really make it pop. Similar to what I did with the snowflake quilt at Finch. It had a blue binding and I used a white thread, and that just, so you could see all of the stitches. Or if you don't want to see them and you just want to, hey, get that binding down, use a thread that blends in with your binding, and it's just a utility purpose, just to get that binding stitch down. Good luck.